Okay, so welcome to the webinar and the presentation that I've prepared for you, looking at assessments for 21st century skills for adults through the Cities of Learning project. So to begin with, to introduce myself, my name's Hazel. I am a teacher, really teacher researcher these days, but my interest and experience in assessment stem from wide-ranging experience, lots of different roles that I've taken in education. Originally trained to teach small children early years in primary school and kindergarten, but my practice really evolved in further education and vocational education over 21 years, working with all sorts of ages of adult learners on vocational programs, lifelong learning programs, but always looking at skills and competences. So this experience led me into teacher training and external quality assurance and examinations, then moving into government, looking at policy and qualification reform and research. A lot of research and teacher training is what I do now. So that's where my sort of experience and knowledge and interest in assessment comes from. So look, I want to begin by considering assessment and its relationship to learning and what we call constructive alignment, how we need to be sure that what we're trying to do in assessment aligns with and supports our goals for learning. Because we have learned a great deal about the theory of learning and how people learn over the last 100 years, and yet our practices in assessment have not really changed. You'll see on this continuum here the sorts of changes that have been most significant in relation to learning and assessment, in the sense that we now believe, for example, our attitude to talent is that it's possible to grow and nurture talent, intelligence, ability, potential. It's not fixed. We very much practice with a growth mindset now. And in our work in entrepreneurial education, particularly, we are very interested in the enterprising mindset. Also, the nature of activities in education is moving more and more from contrived, very school specific or college specific activities into learning activities which are much more authentic and linked to the real world. We are less certain, knowledge is so available now. We're much less interested in right and wrong and what's absolutely true or not, but rather in asking good questions. More interested in practice than theory, more interested in promoting independent and autonomous learning than it only being bound to the classroom always. You know, we have much more flexible and accessible means of learning throughout life now. It isn't restricted only to attending college or attending school. People are learning using massive open online content, coming together to learn in all sorts of interesting and formal and informal ways. As we were discussing earlier, there's increasing interest in how well we can learn together, because people don't learn in isolation. Most human endeavor happens in groups and is the result of collaboration. Also, transparency, openness, and visibility are much more important to the learning process now. We talk about metacognition, learning to learn, learning from experience. We're much more interested. So that when you think about it, the way we think about learning has changed completely. Whereas children used to be these empty pages, or that learners in general, not just children, were empty pages or empty vessels that we as teachers had to fill up somehow with knowledge. We recognize the interactive nature of learning now. And so the role of the teacher has changed. So the teacher is much less the sage on the stage, the wise person with all the answers at the front of the class. Much more nowadays, the teacher is the guide on the side, facilitating learning, setting up learning experiences within which the learner can build and develop their knowledge and progress, and skills and competence, of course. So what is it then that we need in assessment to reflect these changes in assessment, in learning rather? So Bill Lucas, who's a well-known educational theorist and academic in the UK, has sort of really identified 4 characteristics of assessment, which lead to what he sees to be limitations, ways in which assessment is not serving our needs at the moment. And these 4 sort of characteristics of assessment are: what is assessed, how it's assessed, the impact of the assessment, and what uses are made of those assessments. So, for example, the nature of learning then. So whereas in the past, the learning was organised and very often through formal curriculum, or learning is organised in silos and subject boxes, whereas we recognise now that that cross-curricular learning is so important and that learning needs to be deep and wide and collaborative. And so assessment should aim to capture then what are agreed to be desirable kinds of learning, because too often formal traditional assessment can distract learning processes. Learners can have very rich and valuable learning experiences, but then have to swat it all up somehow or revise it somehow to write an essay about it in an exam. And these are not desirable kinds of learning then, that over-reliance on writing from memory, handwriting from memory for 3 hours without a book or a person or the internet. You know, people do not work in these ways anymore. We are also much more interested in capturing a range of strength, often described as head, heart, and hand. So competencies required for learning, life, and employment. Also, sort of traditionally and formally, then the methods, the hows of assessment limit us in the sense that too often assessment happens at the end of an experience. So there's a period of learning, and then there's this summative assessment of learning at the end to somehow make a judgment about that. Whereas we now believe that assessment should be ongoing and authentic and valuable, supporting and enriching learning goals in an ongoing sense. Also, we want to look at carefully evidencing capability, not just memory, not just what people can remember for a couple of days during an exam period. So assessment should establish clear and shared definitions of progress and learning dispositions. We want to look for better evidence of higher order thinking skills, problem solving, creativity, real world application and value, and extended investigations using multimodal evidence. Also, the source of credentials. You know, is it only schools and colleges and awarding organisations who can award qualifications, or should we look to include a wider range of actors, employers, sector experts, vocational practitioners, who really are immersed and live the competencies that we would be looking for learners to develop? Then also the impact, the consequences of the assessment process. Assessment should serve learning progression, supporting development of mastery over time, and reducing the tension between these formative approaches and summative approaches to assessments. Too often, young people become very stressed in examination and formal assessment situations. So we are not getting the best picture of a learner's potential when they are terrified or stressed through the assessment process. Also, we need to look for ways of personalising assessment so that assessment can provide engaging, fair access to measures of progress, which show a wider range of student progress and promote success, not just this ability to memorise. So we're looking for evidence-based narrative, different styles of credentials. And also we're very keen to increase learner ownership of assessment. So we believe that teachers and learners have been very passive in assessment for too long. Assessment is this mysterious process that happens to learners, that they go through this ordeal and then wait for a certain period of time and then get a score or a capital letter. And we believe that learners can be served more effectively in a wider range of more appropriate assessment methods. And that we also believe that assessment should be used mainly to improve learning, to further the aims of learning more generally. So one way of looking at assessment then is what's it for? And always the way we consider the design of assessment, we design assessments to align with the purposes. What are we assessing for? Very often, because teachers have been passive and not particularly empowered in assessment, they just assume that assessments happen. So if you have a period of learning, you better have some sort of test at the end to see if it's worked, you know? And that is very much this concept of summative assessment and the assessment of learning. What learning has taken place as a result of a particular experience or intervention. Then, following the work of Black and Williams, we had a lot of talk about formative assessment, which is assessment for learning. So how can we assess learners in ways which will give them useful information about what steps to take next, what they need to do to improve, and so on. So this is very much about continuing the learning journey by using formative assessment. And the final one that we're which we're most interested in of all is this assessment as learning. So in the same way that we want students and learners to be active in their learning, we want to invite students to be active in their assessment, for them to take the roles of assessor. So they decide what needs to be assessed, how to assess it, what the mark schemes are, what the rubrics are. So from clarifying the purposes of the assessment to structuring the assessment, coming up with a design, to the delivery, to the marking, the whole process of assessment is an opportunity for students to further demonstrate and progress their competence. That's the way we view it. So we're really interested in assessment as learning, and much less so in the other two forms. So this is the competent, when we talk about assessing 21st century skills, this is the framework that we work with mostly, although we do work with DigComp and GreenComp, the other de facto European Commission competence frameworks. But this is a very good spread that we find of competences that we find works for most situations. We've been testing this framework with young people, teachers, women aged between 35 and 55, young migrant entrepreneurs. We've been using it for employability, for curriculum planning. It's a very flexible model. And so these are the competencies that we're interested in most of all. And the examples that I've pulled together for you in this presentation are how we've been using EntreComp in assessment. Now, one of the things that we like about EntreComp is that it brings people together. We can build community around it. It's a shared language of competence and performance, which means that we have a language to use to share practices, to teach each other, to learn from each other as learners and as educators. So one of the things that we really like about it is that it has set out 15 competences over those three sort of areas: ideas and opportunities, managing resources, and interaction. But it sets out the learning outcomes. It has something like 445 learning outcomes. So across 15 competences, and it gives us the different levels, the progression framework across 8 levels. So it's really, really useful. All that work has been done, and it's a shared basis for understanding and practice that we find very useful. But when we first started using EntreComp, people were asking us all the time, how are we supposed to assess this? You know, and that's really what showed us the need for educator assessment literacy, but also critically student assessment literacy. Now, we did an analysis of the 460 learning outcomes in Entrecomp, and something like 35% of them, 35% of the learning outcomes are linked to assessment literacy. So when you think about competencies like learning from experience, self-awareness, understanding your own strengths and weaknesses, so much of this competence is linked to the ability to assess oneself, to be able to look to assess ourselves. And also, we believe it's a really important life skill, assessment literacy, because we're not always managed by people who are effective. So very often throughout life, we will have to manage ourselves, and we will have to recognize our own strengths and weaknesses and use evidence to make judgments about what we're very good at, what we're not so good at, what we need to do next, what we want to learn next, and so on. Now, when we come, what sort of entrepreneurial education is about developing entrepreneurial competencies, but it's also about learning in very particular ways. And we have these pedagogical principles linked to the use of the competence frameworks, which sort of guide us around what the learning needs to be like. So entrepreneurial education is experiential. So it's made up of rich experiences through which learners can develop these competences. It's creativity, you promoting multiple idea generation in an ongoing sense at every stage of the learning, as many ideas, as many new ways of doing things as we can think of. What's also very important to entrepreneurial education are those real world links. So let's solve real world challenges. We don't have to contrive and design not real, pretend scenarios for students. We can provide them with real world scenarios. And these are much more purposeful and meaningful and engaging, and can really engage learners emotionally with issues that are important to them, and really help us to bring out the best in student performance, because it's to do with topics they care about. And also, we can invite real world people to be assessors, to provide feedback to our learners, real world employers, shopkeepers, community members, people who they work with in their communities can be valuable sources of feedback and assessment information. Collaboration is at the heart of entrepreneurial action. And we believe that it's really important that assessment captures how well people work together, because people don't tend to work alone very often. And we can certainly achieve more when we come together to work together. So collaboration is a really critical aspect. But perhaps one of the central sort of ideas in entrepreneurial education is this idea of creating value of different types for other people. So our assessment in entrepreneurial education then needs to be able to capture how well the value that has been created meets the needs of the end users. So when we send learners out into the community to identify needs that they want to meet as a part of their learning, the best assessment is to ask the end users, okay, so if we go out and create value for a group of people, the best assessors are not examiners in the university, they're the people who we've created the value for. So it's involving all sorts of actors from the real world to provide as a part of the assessment process. Also, reflection. One of the competencies in Entrecomp is learning from experience. So we really believe it's critical that learning includes reflection, flexible thinking, and almost as sort of how best to learn from failure. So what are we going to do when things go wrong? We need to overcome, we need to be motivated to persevere and find new ways through. So it's recovering from failure. It's a new way of looking at things. In traditional high stakes formal assessments, failure is a disaster. And because you have one hit at sitting that exam, don't you? Or if you don't pass the exam on that occasion, you have to keep doing the exam until you pass. Well, life is much more like that. It's not one hit. We see learning as something which is ongoing throughout life. So failure is something very important. We can learn our most important lessons from making mistakes, so long as we include that reflection element. But also we're very, very committed, and we think it's very important to making learning visible, making that progress explicit. And that takes particular approaches to assessment around using different types of evidence to represent learning and progress that's been made. So then these principles, then, if we think about the constructive alignment I mentioned earlier and how we want the relationship between the assessment and learning to be very close, we need to consider these principles of entrepreneurial learning as also principles of entrepreneurial assessment. As far as possible, we need to consider these principles in the design of assessments. So, as I've already mentioned, because of the nature of Entrecom and the inclusion of all these learning outcomes and competences linked to self-assessment, we use self-assessment a lot because it's an inherent and significant feature of self-efficacy and working in teams, working with other people, mobilizing other people. And so there are some examples I've included here, like learning journals, reflective journals we encourage learners to use a lot. Portfolios, we're very keen on using multimodal digital portfolios. And we've been using these to good effect with young people, but also with older learners as well. And I'll be showing you an example of a multimodal portfolio so that you can see how simple and yet how flexible they can be. Rubrics are very helpful for self-assessment, and it's very much like the rubric I showed you here. Entrecomp, really, the progression framework is a rubric, you know, and so people can see very clearly where to position themselves in terms of their strengths and weaknesses. If, for example, I am at level 4 in spotting opportunities, I can see the description for level 5 and use that as a target or a goal. Okay, so rubrics, what we tend to use a lot of as a part of self-assessment is what we call competence diagnostics. I can show you an example of one here now. Let me see. This is the competence recognition tool for women aged 35 to 55. So essentially, we present them with each of the competences in turn from Entrecom, and we ask them to scale themselves. How confident and experienced do they feel? So then they select their sort of level for each of the competences, how confident they feel in it. And as a result, at the end of the diagnostic, they'll have a personal profile. So, which is like a spider web diagram. And we tend to do that at the beginning because they will also have a personalized report then. So it'll say, this is your current level, this is your learning goal, here are some useful resources which you can access if you want to develop your skill to the next level. But also, so it's a very useful diagnostic goal setting type approach that we take to self-assessment. We also then use learning contracts, which can also be known as individual learning plans. So that's that individual personal action plan, which sort of accommodates what we call spiky profiles. Because the thing is about the skills development and competence development is it's not all the learners are starting in the same place or progressing at the same pace. People have these spiky profiles. For example, I'm really good at spotting opportunities, much less so at planning and management, you know. Has these very personalized profiles, like fingerprints almost. So individual learners will have individual goals, and there's some learning contracts, and these individual learning plans are a way of managing and recording this personalized progress. And then badges and open recognition, which is another way, another example we'll look at in more detail. Peer assessment we're very keen on. You'll remember one of our principles is collaboration. People are always working together. So we use the peers as an excellent form of support and feedback and mentoring and inspiration. So that learners can teach each other, learners can assess each other, learners can coach each other. The ipsative assessment. Now, we're always looking to prove impact, really, I suppose. So what difference has it made to our learners to be learning in this way or to be using Entrecomp? So we tend to do what we call ipsative assessment, where you have a starting point. So using a tool like the self-assessment tool I just showed you. And then you take a snapshot at the beginning and at the end as a way of capturing that distance traveled or the value added. What is the difference? And we encourage learners to continue to do that at intervals. So you can use quizzes, tests, surveys like the one I showed. You can do much more informal interviews to work out what somebody's hoping to achieve, what somebody's needs, interests, aspirations, what are their goals. And also we can observe progress using a range of sort of observation tools. So we've been doing, this is one of the projects we've been using Entrecomp on recently, and it sort of links to all the sorts of ideas that I've mentioned so far, is using Entrecomp badges. We've called them the Entrecomp award system. And we have a number of objectives in the use of these badges. Which are in addition to assessment, really. We're using the badges as a way of assessment as literacy. So we're using the badges to develop assessment literacy and promote competence development and good practice. But we also want to develop critical assessment literacy competencies to better identify the impact of the work with Entrecomp. So we want to see what competencies are people developing, how are people using Entrecomp, what impacts is Entrecomp achieving, but also that we have this differentiated framework of badges, which I'll be able to show you more about shortly, beginning with the Entrecomp supporter badge. Then supporter can progress to explorer. So somebody's like a supporter will just have found out about Entrecomp. I've just heard of it. It looks great. I'd like to know more. This is my supporter badge. Then once you've started doing a bit more research, looking into the use of Entrecomp a bit more, you've read about some specific examples, that's our explorer badge, and you're able to claim an explorer badge. That then progresses up to practitioner and then up to champion badge. Now, the reason for this is so as a way of inviting people to make progress in their use of Entrecomp. So it's a maturity progression framework. So if you know nothing at all, you can declare your support for Entrecomp. And what we find interesting about this is it moves away from the passive models that I was mentioning. We really want to reverse the flow of assessment design so that the student is encouraged to claim competence when they're ready. So this is what I can do. Here's the evidence. This is how I know, and I'm going to share it and celebrate that. As a part of this, these badge awards, we have built in an element of open recognition, and I'll show you what that looks like now. We've got a practice map. Sorry, that's a bit blurry. Let me take you to the real thing. One sec. Practice map. No. Sorry, bear with me. Here we go. This is the practice map. So essentially, when people claim a badge, they post an example of the practices. I need to tell you a bit more about this first, actually. So the supporter badge, you don't need to upload any evidence. You don't have to prove anything. You can just declare yourself an Entrecomp supporter and you are awarded the badge. For the Entrecomp Explorer, you need to share one thing that you found interesting about Entrecomp because you've learned a little bit more about Entrecomp, one example of how it's used with one group somewhere in one place. So we ask you to share that interesting practice as a part of your claim for an Explorer badge. The next level is a practitioner badge where you have to share 2 practices. Now, this is what this map is about. So to claim your practitioner badge, you have to share 2 practices and post them on the map. So you can see here lots of examples have been posted on the map here, and you can zoom in and see the very specific examples that have been shared here. Now, what we like about this, what we think is interesting about this is, so say, for example, I've gained my supporter badge, I've claimed my Explorer badge, and I'm interested in becoming a practitioner. Well, I'm able to have a look at and learn from the practices shared by practitioners. So we're hoping that it's a learning opportunity, but also inspiration. It's like a neat and effective way of sharing effective practice. So I can see what practitioners are doing, but also what champions are doing. And it's all to do with sort of sphere of influence, really. So the practitioner shares 2 practices, and the champion has to show how they have transformed and influenced practice beyond their organizations. So that's so what we've been looking at, what we've been working with rather in projects is a multimodal digital portfolio, and this is a really nice example of that. I'll show you now. 1 second. Skip verification. Okay. So essentially, the digital portfolio template we've been using is very, very simple. We need to keep it as simple as possible so that there isn't a whole new layer of learning how to use a digital portfolio tool. And sometimes they can be very expensive. You can use very simple tools like PowerPoint, and we're trying to keep it the simpler the better, really. And we're also looking to develop one in OneNote, in Microsoft OneNote, so that you can pre-populate a template with learning outcomes or spaces where learners can upload different types of evidence. But we are very interested in inviting learners to make decisions about how best to evidence their own learning now. And I think this is a really nice example of it, because not only is this a presentation, it's a very holistic view of somebody's potential and somebody's competence and ability. So you'll see that there's the timeline there. That's the person's life set out over 4 areas: personal, education and learning, side projects, and professional path. But this is the bit that's we're most interested in, this multimodal evidence. So it isn't all in writing. It isn't always about writing long, extended text. A picture speaks 1,000 words, you know, so how can we use photographs and brief commentary to give a much richer impression of a whole person. So you'll see there are all sorts of accomplishments shared here. And not only is this a digital multimodal portfolio, it can also be, this is a CV. This is a digital CV. Now, people can keep it very simple and just put a little bit of text, or only use photographs or videos. But it's very flexible, very inclusive, and also it's a real world document that can easily be updated in an ongoing way and used as a digital CV, because it's very easy to animate these PowerPoints, whether you use Google Slides or PowerPoint, whichever. You can put music or voiceover. You can turn it into a really interesting asset, a very useful real world document to use to apply for jobs or funding, or just to represent yourself, however you would like to. So we've been using this digital multimodal portfolio and Entrecomp across a number of different projects, testing it with different types of end users. And it's been really interesting to see how the different groups have taken this format and made it their own, you know, in exactly the way that I described when I say that we want learners to make decisions about how best to represent their learning. It's an opportunity for them to personalize and be creative in terms of how they report their learning. So let's go to this one. Let's think how far. Sorry, bear with me. So yes, so that's the badges, our Entrepreneur badges, the open recognition and the practice map, and the digital multimodal portfolio. But I wanted to leave you with this link because this has got some really lovely examples of the best of what's happening around the world, really. Let me, best or most interesting types of assessment from around the world. Here we go. So there are about 20 something examples of different types of assessment. Here we go. I'm sorry. These are to look at your leisure. So you can search them in this way. Who made it? How's it administered? So there's one digital badges, mastery transcripts, portfolios. So there's the PISA assessments, the International Baccalaureate. Some really lovely examples, but also from Australia, America, New Zealand, all across the world. I really love this character lab one, but there's lots of different, really interesting examples, which are well worth a look at in your own time. Any questions?